Picture a narrow ridge squeezed between desert and sea, no bigger than New Jersey, yet every empire you've ever heard of has marched through it. Imagine in your mind's eye a very particular piece of geography. It is not a vast continent or a wide, sprawling plain. Instead, it is a narrow ridge of land, a slim corridor of earth. This slender piece of land is squeezed, held in a tight embrace, compressed on its sides by two powerful and contrasting natural features. On one side lies the immense and arid desert, a realm of sand, sun, and profound emptiness. On the other side there is the deep and wide sea, a massive body of water that forms a natural and definitive border. So you have this ridge, this strip of land, positioned precariously between the unforgiving desert and the endless sea. To give you a concrete sense of its scale, or rather, its lack of it, understand that this entire territory is no bigger than the American state of New Jersey. It is by any global measure a small place, a compact region, not a sprawling landscape that would naturally draw the attention of the world. And yet, despite its modest size, consider the sheer weight of its history. It seems that every single empire you have ever heard of, every great power that has etched its name into the records of human civilization, has, at some point, marched its armies across this very land. They have all passed through this narrow ridge. Think of the ancient Egyptians with their powerful pharaohs, their pantheon of gods and their formidable chariots. They marched here. The relentless Assyrians, a name that once invoked terror across the ancient world, they too marched through this corridor. Following them were the mighty Babylonians, the builders of grand ziggurats, and the authors of foundational legal codes. They also marched directly through this territory. Then came the intellectually powerful Greeks, carrying their revolutionary ideas of philosophy and democracy, with their disciplined phalanxes led by figures like Alexander the Great. They marched here. And of course the methodical Romans, the unparalleled masters of a vast and long-lasting empire. Their organized legions trod this very ground. After the fall of Rome, the Arabs, emerging from the desert peninsula with a new faith and a vibrant culture, came and marched through it. Then, from the heartlands of Europe, came the zealous crusaders, knights and foot soldiers on what they considered a holy mission, and they too battled and marched through this same small piece of land. The Ottoman Turks, who would go on to build an empire that lasted for 600 years, they marched through it and claimed it as their own. And finally, the Britons, representing the most recent of great global empires upon which the sun never set, they also marched through it, drawing lines on its map. Every single one of these world-shaping empires, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Crusaders, the Ottomans, and the Britons, left something of themselves behind. Each one left its footprints, the literal impressions of their soldiers' sandals and their cavalry's hooves pressed into the soil. But they also left behind metaphorical footprints, lasting and indelible marks on the culture, the language, and the collective memory of the people who lived there. They also, invariably, left scars. These were rarely gentle transitions of power. They were often brutal conquests, resulting in widespread destruction, immense suffering, and the deep psychological wounds of history that fester for generations. And alongside those deep scars, they also left stories. The stories of epic battles, the stories of ambitious kings and conquerors, the stories of religious fervor, and the stories of ordinary people caught in the monumental sweep of these historical events. Footprints, scars, and stories. This is the enduring legacy of countless empires on this tiny contested strip of land. So it is crucial to understand that this place is not just real estate. It cannot be reduced to a mere parcel of land to be appraised, bought, sold, or bartered over. It is not simply a strategic location on a map, valuable only for its position. No, it is something much more profound than that. This land represents the world's most stubborn idea, an idea that has shown incredible resilience, refusing to be extinguished through centuries of upheaval, exile, and conflict. And what precisely is that idea? It is the idea that a people, a distinct and identifiable people, can, after being scattered to the four corners of the earth, finally come home. It is the conviction that they can return to the land of their ancestors, and there, on that same soil, build a nation for themselves. This is the stubborn, persistent, deeply held and powerful idea that this particular land has come to embody. So you need to buckle up, prepare yourself, because we are about to undertake a breathtaking journey through 3 millennia of history. That is 3,000 years of those footprints, those scars, and those stories. So here's the deal, the essential starting point of our story. If we turn back the clock 4,000 years, a vast expanse of time, we find that the place was known then as Canaan. It was not an empty land. The locals, the Canaanites, were already there, settled and established. They were already farming the land, cultivating figs and pressing grapes, living lives tied to the rhythms of the agricultural seasons. Then, into this established world, comes a figure named Abraham. He is not a king or a conqueror. He is a wandering shepherd, a nomad, and he arrives with a truly wild and extraordinary claim. He asserts that he has heard a voice, a divine communication, and this voice has made him a promise. The promise is that this very land, Canaan, will be given to his children, to his descendants forever. Now let's be honest. This sounds crazy, right? It seems like a fantastical, unbelievable story. A man hears a voice that promises him a nation. Except for one confounding fact, his descendants, who would come to be known as the Israelites, somehow, against all odds, turn up in this same land centuries later. Their arrival is not direct. It comes after a long and painful detour through the experience of Egyptian slavery. Did the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds, really split for them to allow their escape? This is a question that has been debated for centuries. Archaeologists and historians argue passionately about the historical accuracy of this miraculous event. But while the scholars debate the texts, the ground itself tells a different story. Around the year 1200 BCE, a new pattern of settlement begins to appear in the hill country of Canaan. Small hilltop villages start popping up, distinct from the Canaanite cities of the plains, and the inhabitants of these villages seem to speak a new language, a precursor to Hebrew, and most significantly, they worship a single unseen God, a deity they call Yahweh. This monotheistic focus is a radical departure from the polytheistic cultures surrounding them. Fast forward a couple of centuries. The Israelites, now a collection of tribes, look at their neighbors, the Philistines, the Moabites, and others, and they see that these neighbors all have kings. They decide they want a king too, someone to unite them and lead them in battle. A man named Saul is chosen to unite the clans, becoming their first king. After him comes David, a charismatic leader who conquers a small Jebusite hilltop fortress, and, in a stroke of political genius, crowns it as his capital, Jerusalem. Then comes David's son Solomon, who builds a magnificent temple in Jerusalem, a structure so grand and opulent that it would undoubtedly make all the neighboring kingdoms jealous. It becomes the focal point of the nation's religious and political life. But this golden age of unity is short-lived. Just one generation after Solomon, the kingdom tears itself in two. The northern tribes form their own kingdom called Israel, while the southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin remain loyal to David's dynasty, forming the kingdom of Judah. This division weakens them both. In the year 722 BCE, the mighty Assyrian Empire sweeps down from the north and completely erases the northern kingdom of Israel from history, scattering its people. Then, in 586 BCE, it is the southern kingdom's turn. The Babylonians, the new dominant power, conquer Judah, burn Solomon's magnificent temple to the ground, and carry the Jewish leadership into exile in Babylon. It seems like the end of the story. Game over, right? But it was hardly the end. For these exiled people, the experience of exile itself becomes a new kind of strength, a superpower. This superpower was called memory. They remembered their land, their king, their temple, and their God, and this memory would fuel their will to survive and eventually to return. After decades of exile in Babylon, a new empire rises, the Persians. The Persian emperor, Cyrus the Great, has a different policy from the Babylonians. He allows the exiled peoples, including the Jews, to return to their homelands. So the exiles from Judah are permitted to come home and to rebuild their sacred temple in Jerusalem. You can think of it as version 2.0 of the temple, a new beginning on the ashes of the old. This second temple becomes the center of Jewish life for the next several centuries. Then, a new force storms in from the west, Alexander the Great and his Greek armies. With him comes Greek culture, its language, its philosophy, its art, and its architecture. Greek columns and gymnasiums begin to appear in Judea. Some of the Jewish population are fascinated by this cosmopolitan new fashion. They embrace Hellenism. But a powerful faction, who come to be known as the Maccabees, say thanks, but no thanks to this cultural assimilation. They lead a revolt against the Greek rulers, and against all odds they win a brief, brilliant flash of national independence. But this independence is fragile. Soon, a new and even more powerful empire enters the scene, Rome. The Roman general Pompey the Great marches his legions into Jerusalem. In a profound act of desecration, his soldiers swagger into the Holy of Holies, the most sacred chamber of the Jewish temple, where only the high priest was allowed to enter once a year. Imagine the violation of someone barging into your most private space, your bedroom, with muddy boots, and you get a sense of the shock and horror. A local client king, Herod the Great, tries to curry favor with his Jewish subjects and his Roman masters by launching a massive renovation of the temple, expanding it into a truly magnificent structure of marble and gold. But you can't buy genuine loyalty with marble. Rebellion continues to brew just beneath the surface, fueled by resentment of Roman rule and messianic expectations. Finally, in the year 66 CE, a full-scale revolt breaks out. It is a disaster. In the year 70 CE, the Roman legions crush the rebellion, and in a moment of terrible historical symmetry, they burn the Second Temple to the ground. It happens on the very same day of the Jewish calendar, Tisha B'Av, as the destruction of the First Temple by the Babylonians centuries earlier. The Romans renamed the province of Judea to Syria-Palestina in an attempt to erase its Jewish identity. With their political center and their spiritual heart destroyed, the Jewish people scatter once more, beginning a long exile. This time they carry with them not swords of rebellion but sacred scrolls of their texts, which would become the portable homeland that sustained them. In the wake of the temple's destruction, Judaism had to reinvent itself to survive. Without the central place of sacrifice, the religion became portable. The grand ceremonies were replaced by prayers recited in small rooms, wherever Jews found themselves. The authority of the priests was replaced by the authority of rabbis, scholars who debated and interpreted the sacred texts. Great centers of Jewish learning emerged in far-flung places like Babylon, Spain, and Poland, creating a rich body of law and thought that would guide the scattered communities. Meanwhile, back in the Roman Empire, a small Jewish sect, which had insisted that their crucified teacher, Jesus of Nazareth, was the Messiah, began to grow. Over time, this group, known as Christians, quietly slipped into the Roman mainstream. Eventually, it would become the dominant religion of the very empire that had crucified its founder. Hello, Christianity. Centuries later, in the year 636 CE, a new force emerged from the Arabian desert. Arab warriors on horseback, fired by the new faith of Islam, arrived in the land. They too laid claim to Jerusalem, and specifically to the same rock, the Temple Mount, where Jews believed Abraham had almost sacrificed his son Isaac. The Muslims had their own tradition that the Prophet Muhammad had ascended to heaven from that very spot. And so they built a magnificent shrine over the rock, the Dome of the Rock. With its glittering golden dome, it looked like a giant gold coin dropped onto the city's skyline, a stunning statement of Islam's arrival. 400 years after that, a new set of warriors arrived, the Crusaders from Christian Europe. They rode in with the intention of reclaiming the Holy Land from Muslim rule. They fought their way into Jerusalem and conducted a horrific slaughter of its Muslim and Jewish inhabitants in its narrow, ancient streets. They held the city for a time, but eventually lost the place to the great Muslim Sultan, Saladin. After the Crusaders, new rulers took their turn. First came the Mamluks, a dynasty of slave soldiers from Egypt, and then came the powerful Ottoman Turks, who would incorporate the land into their vast empire. And yet, through all these changes of rule, all these centuries of conquest and shifting empires, a Jewish presence never entirely vanished from the land. Small communities of Jewish families never entirely left. They could be found praying at the last remnant of their temple, the Western Wall, or farming in the hills of the Galilee, or living in the four holy cities, paying their taxes to whichever ruler was in power, just like everyone else. For a period of about 400 years, from 1517 to 1917, the land was under the rule of the Ottoman sultans based in Constantinople. For most of this long era, the sultans treated Jerusalem not as a major capital but really more like a sleepy, remote provincial town. It was, you could say, a period of relative stability, a long, quiet calm. The Jewish communities living under Ottoman rule were granted the official status of dhimmi, or protected people. Now this meant they were considered second-class citizens and had to pay special taxes, but their lives and property were, for the most part, stable and secure. During this time, vibrant spiritual centers emerged. In the mystical city of Tzfat, up in the Galilean hills, Kabbalists developed new forms of Jewish mysticism, a kind of coffeehouse mysticism that blended ancient secrets with daily life. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, pious yeshiva students spent their days studying sacred texts, trading jokes and stories as they performed the arduous daily task of hauling water uphill to their homes in the old city. Then, in the 1800s, the modern world began to intrude. New technologies like the steamship dramatically shortened travel times, connecting the port of Jaffa to cities like Odessa in Russia in just about 2 weeks. At the same time, life for Jews in the Russian Empire became increasingly precarious. A wave of violent anti-Jewish riots known as pogroms swept through Russia, sending terrified and ragged families fleeing for their lives. Some of these families began sailing south toward the ancient homeland. These early pioneers, driven by a mix of desperation and ancient hope, began to buy up parcels of land. Often it was swampy, malarial land that was considered undesirable. They set about the back-breaking work of draining the swamps and cultivating the earth. In their new settlements, they argued passionately in Yiddish under the shade of newly planted orange trees. At the same time, the economic activity generated by these new arrivals drew in Arab laborers from surrounding regions like Egypt and Syria, who drifted in looking for work. At this stage, nobody was really planning for a major national clash. It was a time of small-scale settlement and local interactions, not grand political conflict. Yet the pieces were being placed on the board for a future confrontation. The year is 1894, and the city is Paris. A Jewish journalist from Vienna named Theodor Herzl is covering the infamous trial of Alfred Dreyfus, a French Jewish army captain falsely accused of treason. In the streets outside the courtroom, Herzl hears angry mobs screaming, "Death to the Jews!" For Herzl, this is a moment of shocking, clarifying insight, a real light bulb moment. He concludes that even in modern enlightened Western Europe, Jews will never be fully accepted. If Europe won't have them, he reasoned, maybe the old new land of their ancestors will. From this realization, the movement of modern political Zionism is born. It's the idea that the Jewish people need to establish their own sovereign state in their historical homeland to be safe and free. Inspired by this new ideology, idealistic young people calling themselves Halutzim, or pioneers, began making their way to Ottoman Palestine. They were not just seeking refuge, they were on a mission to build a new society from the ground up. They engaged in the hard physical labor of planting eucalyptus trees to dry the swamps, and they undertook the monumental task of reviving the ancient Hebrew language, transforming it from a purely liturgical tongue into a modern spoken language for everyday life. In their collective agricultural communities, the kibbutzim, they argued passionately about socialist ideals and about practical matters, like who was responsible for milking the cow on the Sabbath. As these European newcomers established their presence, the local Arab population watched as new villages with distinctive red roofs began to rise on the hillsides. They saw these strange newcomers with their foreign ways and languages, and began to wonder who exactly had invited them to this land. The seeds of tension were definitely being sown. Then, the First World War erupted, completely shattering the old world order. The war brought an end to 4 centuries of Ottoman rule in the region. A new power, Great Britain, took control of the map. In the fog of war, Britain made a series of confusing and contradictory promises, offering support for a Jewish national home in Palestine, while also making promises of independence to the Arabs. The fuse for a long and bitter conflict had been well and truly lit. After World War I, Great Britain was granted a mandate by the League of Nations to govern Palestine. On paper, Britain's job sounded simple enough. They were tasked with helping to create a Jewish national homeland in Palestine, while at the same time protecting the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish, or Arab communities. Good luck with that. It was a fundamentally contradictory mission, and it proved to be impossible to achieve. Jewish immigration to Palestine began to jump significantly. In 1919, 35,000 Jews arrived. By 1925, that number had swelled to 60,000 in a single year. These waves of immigration were often driven less by Zionist ideology and more by the desperate need to escape the violent pogroms and persecution in Eastern Europe. The growing Jewish presence and land purchases led to increasing alarm and resentment among the Arab population. This tension soon exploded into violence. Arab riots erupted in 1920, and again in 1921, and again with more intensity in 1929. The violence climaxed in the brutal Hebron massacre of 1929, where dozens of Jews were killed and the ancient Jewish community of that city was destroyed. Faced with escalating conflict, the British tried to control the situation by limiting Jewish immigration. In 1939, on the very eve of World War II, Britain issued a policy paper that slammed the gates shut on Jewish immigration to Palestine. This decision came at the precise moment that the Jews of Europe were facing a genocide of unimaginable scale. When the smoke of the Holocaust finally cleared in 1945, 6 million Jews were dead. The survivors, broken but alive, were crammed into displaced persons camps across Europe with nowhere to go. The horrific reality of the Holocaust created a new, desperate urgency to solve the problem of Jewish homelessness. The British, unable to manage the situation, handed the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. The UN investigated and proposed a 2-state solution to partition the land of Palestine into 2 separate states, one for the Jews and one for the Arabs, with Jerusalem to be an international city. The Jewish leadership, feeling they had no other choice, accepted the plan. The Arab leadership and the surrounding Arab states vehemently rejected it. The stage was set for a war that the next chapter of history would decide. On May 14, 1948, the day the British mandate expired, David Ben-Gurion stood in Tel Aviv and declared the establishment of the State of Israel. Immediately, armies from 5 neighboring Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq, swarmed in, determined to destroy the newborn state at its birth. Israel's army, the Israel Defense Forces, was essentially born overnight. It was a ragtag force, desperately short on equipment. They had to cast their own bullets in secret underground workshops. They armored their buses with makeshift steel fence plates. They used homemade mortars they called Davidkas, which were honestly, notoriously inaccurate, and made much more noise than they inflicted actual damage. Against all the odds, against the combined might of 5 regular armies, the new state of Israel survived the war. But this survival came at a tremendous cost. During the fighting, roughly 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled from their homes or were pushed out by Israeli forces. To this day, history books and the two peoples themselves still fight fiercely over the right verb to use. Fled, were expelled, were driven out. For Israelis, it was the War of Independence. For Palestinians, it was the Nakba, or the catastrophe. With the war over and independence secured, the new state of Israel flung open its gates. A flood of Jewish immigrants began to pour in. Holocaust survivors came from the displaced persons camps of Europe. Entire communities of Yemeni Jews, including babies and the elderly, were airlifted to Israel in a mission dubbed Operation Magic Carpet. Iraqi and Moroccan Jews facing persecution in their home countries arrived in dusty, continuous streams. The new country was overwhelmed. New arrivals were housed in massive tent cities called Ma'abarat, which over time grew and evolved into the suburbs of cities like Tel Aviv. The new Jewish state was a chaotic, messy, and noisy place, but it was vibrantly and defiantly alive. The 1950s in Israel were a time of extreme austerity and nation-building. The period was defined in equal parts by ration cards, which limited citizens to basic necessities like 2 eggs per week, and by the relentless laying of irrigation pipes to make the desert bloom. It was a time of hardship, but also of great idealism. On the kibbutzim, the collective farms, children sang patriotic pioneer songs under the starlight, filled with the spirit of building a new nation. Then, in 1967, tensions with the neighboring Arab states boiled over once again. Egypt closed the Straits of Tiran, cutting off Israel's southern port, and Arab armies began to mass on Israel's borders, openly declaring their intention to attack. In a preemptive strike, Israel launched a stunningly successful military campaign. In just 6 days, the tiny country tripled its size. It captured the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the entire West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, Jewish people reached the Western Wall, the last remnant of their ancient temple. Israeli paratroopers, tough soldiers who had just fought a fierce battle for the old city, were photographed weeping at the ancient stones. But the immense pride of this victory quickly turned complicated. Overnight, Israel had gone from being the underdog fighting for survival to being the occupier, ruling over more than 1 million Palestinians in the newly captured territories. The Arab world reacted with defiance. The Arab League met in Khartoum and issued its famous 3 no's: no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel. Meanwhile, a new force began to emerge from the shadows of defeat, the Palestinian guerrilla movements, like the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, which launched a campaign of international terrorism against Israeli and Jewish targets. The great victory of 1967, which seemed like a final resolution, had instead sown the seeds of the next, even more complex crisis. In October 1973, on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the Jewish year, Egypt and Syria launched a coordinated surprise attack on Israel. Caught completely off guard, the Israeli army suffered heavy losses in the initial days of the war. Although Israel eventually fought back and won a military victory, the war shocked the nation to its very core. The trauma of the near disaster shattered the sense of invincibility that had followed the 1967 war. But sometimes trauma can open doors. The war convinced the Egyptian president, Anwar Sadat, a man who had once been a supporter of Hitler, that Israel could not be defeated militarily. In a stunning and courageous move, Sadat flew to Jerusalem in 1977 and spoke before the Israeli parliament, the Knesset. This historic act led to the Camp David Accords and a formal peace treaty between Israel and Egypt, signed in 1979. Israel returned the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt in exchange for peace. But the treaty, while groundbreaking, left the central Palestinian issue unresolved. This unresolved issue exploded in 1987 with the outbreak of the First Intifada, or uprising, in the West Bank and Gaza. It was a largely grassroots rebellion, characterized by powerful images of Palestinian children and teenagers throwing stones at heavily armed Israeli soldiers. The world watched, and the images of the conflict put immense international pressure on Israel. This new reality eventually led to secret negotiations between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization, culminating in the Oslo Accords in 1993. The world was captivated by the iconic image of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and PLO Chairman Yasser Arafat shaking hands on the White House lawn. There was a moment of widespread hope and cheering. It seemed peace was finally within reach, but the optimism was soon shattered. In 1995, Prime Minister Rabin was assassinated by a right-wing Jewish extremist who opposed the peace process. Palestinian suicide bombers began blowing up buses in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. The peace process faltered, and in the year 2000, a second intifada erupted. This one was far more violent and militarized than the first, leaving thousands of Israelis and Palestinians dead. In response to the wave of suicide bombings, Israel began constructing a controversial security barrier along and inside the West Bank. Israelis saw it as a life-saving security fence. Palestinians called it the apartheid wall, a tool to annex land and imprison their population. The Israel of the 21st century often looks like a high-tech mirage. It has become a global powerhouse in innovation, a so-called startup nation famous for its contributions to cybersecurity, for inventions like the Waze navigation app, for agricultural technology that produced the cherry tomato, and for its flamboyant Eurovision Song Contest wins. On the beaches of Tel Aviv, young people enjoy vibrant parties that seem a world away from any conflict, taking place under the protective umbrella of the Iron Dome missile defense system. Yet, this image of modern normalcy is periodically shattered. Every few summers, it seems, the cycle of violence with Hamas-ruled Gaza repeats. Rockets fly from Gaza into Israeli towns, and Israel responds with overwhelming air power. There have been 3 major wars and countless smaller skirmishes and ceasefires, but the brutal cycle of conflict continues to spin. In a dramatic move in 2005, Israel unilaterally pulled all of its soldiers and settlers out of the Gaza Strip, hoping this would lead to peace on that front. Instead, the militant Islamist group Hamas seized complete control of the territory, and Gaza became a launchpad for attacks against Israel. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, the number of Israeli settlers living in communities beyond the 1967 lines has grown to over 500,000. This expansion of settlements has made the map for a potential two-state solution look like a scattering of disconnected jigsaw puzzle pieces, making a contiguous Palestinian state seem increasingly unlikely. At the same time, the story of Israel's own Arab citizens continues to evolve. They now make up over 20% of the population. They vote in Israeli elections. They serve as judges on the Supreme Court, and they wrestle with their dual identity as Arabs and Israelis, arguing politics under the fireworks that celebrate Israel's Independence Day. In a major diplomatic shift in 2020, the Abraham Accords added the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain to the small club of Arab nations that have made peace with Israel. This development has caused the Palestinian cause to slip down the list of priorities for many regional powers. But despite this, the core question of the conflict refuses to be muted. It remains a story of one land, two peoples, and zero consensus on how to share it. So, after 3 millennia of history, after the building of 2 temples and the survival of 1 ancient wall, we are still here observing this ongoing story. The original promise of Zionism was, in its essence, quite simple. It was the promise of creating a tiny homeland, a safe harbor, for a stubborn people who had endured centuries of persecution and exile. That promise, in many ways, has been fulfilled. But the question that has arisen from the fulfillment of that promise is infinitely more messy and complex. That question is this: how do two peoples, both with deep historical and emotional ties to the same small piece of land, learn to share it without one or both of them losing their identity, their security, and their sense of self in the process? Until that profound and difficult riddle finally finds an answer, this story will keep on writing its next chapter, one headline, one heartbeat, and one ancient olive tree at a time.